When a new homeowner's cedar fence is torn down by a power-hungry HOA president wielding a chainsaw and a vendetta, a quiet cul-de-sac erupts into a battle of property lines, legal documents, and cunning strategy where one man's fight for his yard becomes a neighborhood's rebellion against petty tyranny.
Is this your fence?
The officer's voice cracked through the morning air loud enough to hush the murmurs gathering
behind the patrol car.
I stood in my driveway barefoot, blinking in disbelief. As the red and blue lights bounced off the jagged remains of what used to be my cedar privacy fence.
Across from me,
Karen stood smugly, arms folded, her lips twisted into the kind of grin that
only appears when someone believes they've just won.
Behind her, a man in a neon vest revved a chainsaw again, slicing through another panel while wood chips sprayed the sidewalk.
"Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back," the officer warned.
But she waved him off like a waitress ignoring a rude customer.
"This is community property,"
she declared loudly, making sure every neighbor could hear. His fence was over
the line. "I'm just enforcing the rules."
Her voice dripped with entitlement, and as I opened my mouth to respond, my neighbor Tom from 2 houses down muttered, "She's lost it." The crowd that had formed, some still in pajamas, holding mugs of coffee, watched with wide eyes as a second officer pulled out a clipboard and began writing a report.
"Do you have any proof this was your property?" the first cop asked me, his tone already worn down from whatever Karen had told him before I arrived. I swallowed the rising burn in my chest. "Yes, I have the plat map and the permit." "She's lying." Karen turned toward me with that mock concerned frown she wore so well.
"Oh, sweetie, don't embarrass yourself.
You should have read the HOA bylaws. I'm the president for a reason."
I stepped forward, fists clenched, but the officer held up a hand and muttered, "Sir, stay where you are." Somewhere in the distance, I heard the click of a phone camera and a whisper.
"This is going on next door." And just like that, the moment froze. The crushed wood, the legal threats, the humiliating standoff, the petty power plays, all bubbling over in front of the entire neighborhood. It didn't start this way. 2 weeks ago, I thought I'd moved to a peaceful cul-de-sac with clean sidewalks and friendly people. I didn't know I was stepping into a suburban war zone. It started with the dog bags. A few days after I moved in, I got a letter taped to my front door. No envelope, just a neatly typed note with a cursive signature. "Please pick up your dog's waste immediately. Multiple complaints have been submitted. Sincerely, HOA President Karen L. McKinley." The thing was, I didn't own a dog. I didn't even let the neighbor's cat wander onto my porch. At first, I laughed it off. A simple misunderstanding, maybe. I walked over to her porch and left a note clarifying it wasn't me. The next day, there was another message. "This is your final warning." No signature, just taped right across my mailbox in red ink. I should have known then. She didn't want clarification. She wanted control. Every week, something small happened.
My trash cans were pulled back from the curb a few inches too neatly.
Always before I got home from work. A potted plant disappeared from my front step. My mailbox, once black, was suddenly painted a dull HOA approved white. No note, no request, just changed. I knocked on Karen's door once to ask about it.
She smiled sweetly, her eyes
cold as a meat locker. "Oh, I thought we agreed on uniformity." I filed the approval myself. "Don't you love how it matches the rest of the street?"
I told her I hadn't agreed to anything.
She blinked, shrugged, and said, "Well, now you have." Then she closed the door. At
the monthly HOA meeting, I tried to speak up about the mailbox, the harassment, the strange way she seemed
to rewrite rules depending on her mood.
I barely got 5 words in before she
patted the table and announced motion to move on. New residents need time to adjust.
The vote passed with silent nods.
I looked around the room, waiting
for someone to push back, but they all avoided my gaze.
No one wanted to challenge her.
They'd seen what happened
when people did.
The fence was the last thing my father helped me build before he passed.
I stained it myself, reinforced the base with gravel, and filed the permits to make sure it followed every local code. It was 2 feet inside the property line. Carefully measured, not a single inch out of bound.
I put it up for privacy, not to
challenge anyone.
But when Karen came around with her tape measure and a folder full of fake violations, she zeroed in on it like a shark smelling blood.
You know, she said one morning as I
watered my front hedge,
some people find fences antisocial. They're dividing. Separatist.
She emphasized the word like I was trying to start a cult.
I told her I liked my space.
She stared a little too long, then smiled and said, "Space
isn't always yours to keep." That same week, a new notice showed up on my door. Your fence is out of compliance. Remove within 10 days or the HOA will take corrective action. Signed, of course, by Karen. I emailed the city inspector,
attached all the paperwork, and received a clear reply.
Your fence is legally compliant and permitted.
I printed it out, framed it, and nailed it to the inside of my fence just for good
measure.
When Karen saw it, she stopped in the middle of the street and glared at me like I'd insulted her ancestry. Then she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my yard, the fence, the mailbox, everything.
The next
week, I noticed a white pickup parked near her driveway with a trailer carrying power tools.
I didn't think much of it until I saw a man walk around with a clipboard and a laser level. Karen stood next to him, arms crossed, pointing toward my fence. I walked over and asked what was going on. She didn't even look at me.
The man mumbled, "We're conducting a boundary review at the request of the HOA.
I said, "That's already been settled with the city." Karen turned, her voice syrupy. "Oh, I'm
sure it has, but the HOA has its own standard.
We just want to keep things orderly."
2 days later, I came home from work to find a red sticker on my front
door. Violation notice. Fence encroachment pending removal. I checked the timestamp.
It was posted 10 minutes after I'd left that morning.
There was no signature, just the HOA letterhead and a date. I knocked on Karen's door again, and this time she didn't open.
She shouted from inside, "Take it up with
the board." That night, I stayed up researching property laws, HOA overreach, city code enforcement. Anything that could give me leverage. I printed everything. I even bought a drone to map the lot lines. And that's when I noticed something strange. An undeveloped patch of land behind Karen's property.
It wasn't part of her parcel.
It wasn't HOA common land.
According to the county records, it was privately
owned and listed for sale.
I stared at the screen for a long time, heart pounding, as a ridiculous idea began to form.
The next morning, I called the number on the listing and asked for a tour. The agent told me no one had shown interest in over a year. It was considered awkwardly shaped with limited street access. I told him I didn't mind. I had some very specific plans because
if Karen wanted to play games with property lines, she had no idea how far
I was willing to go. The morning after the confrontation, I sat at my dining
table with 3 different plat maps spread out in front of me, a steaming mug of black coffee untouched beside my
laptop.
The maps were copies of the same parcel, my property, and the ones surrounding it, but from different sources. The city planning office, the county land assessor's site, and the real estate agent who'd listed the parcel behind Karen's home. They all confirmed the same thing. My fence was completely within bounds, and the narrow strip of land curving around her backyard wasn't hers, wasn't HOA common ground, and wasn't even under discussion in any local planning meetings. It was a forgotten slice of suburban puzzle piece property, accidentally bypassed when the neighborhood was divided 2 decades ago. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, only that having it meant something. It meant leverage. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stronger than frustration. I felt focus. But to really understand how Karen had gotten this much power, enough to wield landscapers and officers like chess pieces, I had to go back further to the HOA meeting that had set everything in motion. It had taken place 3 weeks earlier in the basement of the community center beneath the flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of off-brand coffee. I'd been attending every meeting since I moved in, mostly to keep an eye on what new restrictions they'd try to enforce. That night was the vote on visual compliance. Karen's proposal, of course. It sounded harmless enough. A policy encouraging uniform visual appeal to protect property values. But when the draft policy was passed around, it was anything but harmless. It gave the HOA president power to issue citations without a vote, allowed them to define violations at their discretion, and most worryingly enabled them to take action after reasonable warning. There were no real checks, no oversight, just one signature. Away from disaster. I raised my hand to speak. This seems dangerously vague, I said. You're giving one person the authority to enforce rules based on opinion. That's not how this should work. Karen smiled with her lips, but not her eyes. We trust the board to act in the neighborhood's best interest, she said smoothly. If you have concerns, you're welcome to file a motion. I looked around. No one else raised a voice. Some nodded nervously. Others kept their heads down. A few looked toward Karen like they were hoping she wouldn't notice them not clapping. The vote passed 8-2. I was one of the 2. That was the night I realized Karen didn't just run the HOA. She ran the whole social order of the neighborhood. She was the type of person who hosted wine nights only for certain women on the block, who collected small favors and paid them back with influence. She controlled gossip like a faucet, tightening it when you behaved, drowning you when you didn't. There was the retired teacher on Hawthorne Street whose daughter got dropped from the community babysitting co-op after she questioned Karen's holiday lifespan. Or the young couple with the Jeep that got mysteriously towed 3 times in a month after asking too many questions about the budget. Karen didn't need to yell. She just needed to let it be known she disapproved. And then things would start to happen. She'd been president of the HOA for 5 years running, unchallenged in every election. Her name printed neatly on every form, every newsletter, every vote. Her power didn't come from screaming. It came from the silence she inspired. But I didn't grow up in silence. I grew up watching my dad get pushed around by contractors, lawyers, neighbors, bosses, until one day he just snapped and refused to take it anymore. He taught me that some people mistake kindness for weakness and that if you give them enough rope, they'll wrap themselves in it. The week after that meeting, things escalated. My mailbox was tagged again, not painted this time, but stickered with a fake compliance warning that didn't match the city's formatting. I received a cease and desist email from the HOA's lawyer, who turned out to be Karen's nephew, about allegedly creating discord at public meetings. Someone even reported
My address for an unpermitted business activity, which led to a very confused city worker asking if I was operating a mechanic shop out of my garage. Karen was playing the long game. She wasn't trying to punish me all at once. She was slowly wearing me down with petty pressure, hoping I'd sell or submit. What she didn't know was that I had spent years working in litigation support, and I'd seen every kind of manipulative paper trail a person could fabricate. I knew how to track things. I knew how to document everything. And I was learning fast how rules could be bent both ways. I began collecting everything. I started small, taking time-stamped photos of my yard from different angles every day. I logged every note left on my property, every email from the HOA, every time I saw her hovering on the sidewalk taking photos of my home. I even installed a small security camera facing the sidewalk. Legal in our county, as a preemptive measure. What I captured over the next few days was shocking. Karen walking up to my porch and bending slightly over the threshold as if peering into my mailbox. Her pausing at the side fence gate and rattling it, checking the latch. One night, I saw her walking with a flashlight in the easement between my home and the drainage ditch, muttering into her phone. At this point, it was no longer about aesthetics. This was obsession. I finally decided to speak with one of the board members privately. Rob, a quiet guy who mostly kept to himself. I ran into him at the hardware store and casually mentioned the new policy. He rolled his eyes and said, "Look, I don't love it, but Karen writes those things so vaguely. No one really reads them. We just vote yes to get through the meetings. If we say no, she drags it out for an hour." That was all I needed to know. Karen had designed the system for convenience, hers, and convenience had bred complacency. She used it to squeeze through authority like a snake in a vent. The neighbors weren't loyal. They were just tired. The final straw came when I returned home one afternoon to find the landscapers inside my property line. My fence hadn't been touched yet, but a deep red line had been spray painted along the grass, tracing a path around my backyard, like some kind of sinister blueprint. I asked them what they were doing, and one of them shrugged. Just marking for removal. We were told it was scheduled. By who? I demanded. He pointed across the street, where Karen was standing on her porch, sipping from a wineglass, watching. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the plat map again. Only this time, I wasn't just trying to protect what was mine. I was thinking about a fence. The silence after I finalized the land purchase was delicious. It felt like holding a winning hand in poker with everyone else too arrogant to notice the twitch in your eye. The deed was mine. Legally registered and notarized, and yet nothing visibly changed in the neighborhood, which made it even better. I walked past Karen's house each evening like usual, nodding politely if she happened to be pruning her hydrangeas or rearranging her collection of ceramic garden gnomes. But inside, I was counting every inch of that strange little parcel that curved around her backyard like a trap waiting to be sprung. She had no clue. The access lane she used to back out her trailer, the little side path her gardener parked on, even the sliver of open grass she'd used for years to host her smug weekend wine tastings. All of it now belonged to me, and I wasn't going to make a move just yet. I wanted her to believe she'd won. Let her feel comfortable. Let her get cocky. Meanwhile, I began collecting information in earnest. The first place I started was zoning. Most people think zoning is boring, acronyms and setback rules and code numbers, but it's where power lives. I learned that the property I now owned was Zone R1 residential. But because of the access easement that had never been paved, I could technically install temporary structures. under a certain square footage without permits. I could also erect privacy fences within legal bounds so long as they didn't block utility access. That gave me options. I visited the city planning office in person, asking innocent-sounding questions about fence heights, setback measurements, even municipal path closures. The clerk at the front desk, an older woman named Joyce, seemed delighted someone actually cared about the rules. She printed off a dozen maps for me, highlighted regulations in pink, and walked me through temporary fencing guidelines as if I were building a dog park. I thanked her sincerely. She had no idea she was helping me design the slowest, sharpest kind of revenge. After that, I turned to something less bureaucratic and more satisfying: drone mapping. I already had a drone from my earlier property inspection. Now, I used it to build a precise visual overlay of Karen's yard and the surrounding land. I flew the drone quietly at dawn, programmed to trace the borders and catalog images every few feet. From the footage, I could see how her fence wasn't straight. It encroached slightly over the boundary I now owned by about 9 in one corner, and a full 24 in where her hedge leaned. She had planted a lilac bush right at the edge, assuming no one would challenge her. The irony was painful. I captured the footage, labeled it with timestamps, and saved it all to a secure drive. Later, if she tried to argue anything, I'd have visual proof from every angle. She loved to play queen. I was laying out the chessboard. Of course, Karen wasn't idle during this time. She had started escalating again. I began receiving friendly reminders from the HOA about my prolonged presence on community sidewalk. Once, after walking back from the mailbox, I found a note that said, "Low loitering is discouraged," printed on HOA stationery. Another time, I came home to a freshly chalked arrow on the sidewalk pointing toward my backyard with the word boundary scrolled in block letters. Subtle intimidation, passive-aggressive tactics, always wrapped in plausible deniability. But she couldn't help herself. She had to keep pushing even without knowing what she was pushing against. Then came the moment when I knew she was getting desperate. Late one afternoon, as I was raking leaves from my front lawn, a man pulled up in a silver SUV with tinted windows. He wore a badge on a chain and introduced himself as a community compliance consultant. His shirt had no logo. His clipboard was generic. He asked if I had a moment to discuss potential rule infractions. I said, absolutely. I invited him in, offered him a seat at the kitchen table, and then started asking him questions. Within 5 minutes, it became clear he wasn't affiliated with the city or the HOA in any official way. He was a contractor likely hired by the board, or more specifically by Karen, to perform unofficial compliance surveys to collect evidence for potential legal action. I asked for his credentials. He stuttered. I asked for a business card. He didn't have one. I thanked him for his time and walked him to the door. Before he left, he looked genuinely confused. "You're taking this seriously," he said. I smiled and replied, "More seriously than you'll ever know." That weekend, I made my first visible move. I installed a row of narrow posts along the entrance to the access lane behind Karen's house. Technically, they were survey markers. Temporary, removable, and fully legal under the zoning code. I didn't block the path entirely. I just made it obvious that someone was claiming it. The posts were painted bright orange and spaced precisely 6 feet apart, just wide enough to allow foot traffic, but too narrow for a vehicle. Karen noticed them within hours. I heard the slam of her back screen door, followed by the crunch of her sandals against the gravel as she stormed over to the lane. She didn't knock on my door. She didn't call. She just stood there, hands on hips, staring at the markers like they had personally insulted her hydrangeas. I watched from the window, letting her simmer. The next day, I received a formal letter from the HOA alleging obstruction of emergency vehicle access. I responded with a copy of the zoning regulation that proved otherwise and included a notarized statement from the city planner confirming that the access lane was not a designated emergency route. I cited the entire board and attached a high-resolution image of Karen's own trailer parked illegally across that lane 2 weeks prior. That response earned silence, not apology, not acknowledgement, just silence. And that told me everything I needed to know. She was rattled. I decided it was time to visit the county assessor's office again, this time for a different reason. I asked for the most recent assessments on Karen's property and the parcels adjacent to hers. The woman at the desk, younger than the one before, gave me a curious look, but printed the documents without comment. As I scanned through the valuation figures, I noticed something curious. Karen's property value had been slowly decreasing over the last 2 years, primarily due to unverified improvements and a pending zoning review listed in a 2023 notation that could work to my advantage. If I submitted a minor change request to zoning, like a fence or shed, it could trigger a reassessment. At the very least, it would send someone onto her property with a clipboard and a camera. I smiled as I folded the documents and slid them into my file. No need to attack head-on when the system could do it for you. As a final flourish that week, I built a temporary wooden gate at the far end of the access lane, the part that no one ever used except Karen's lawn crew. It was simple, clean, and locked with a basic padlock. I left a printed sign on it that read, "Private property. Please respect boundaries." It wasn't hostile. It wasn't even aggressive, but it sent a message. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in the same fluorescent-lit basement where the visual compliance policy had been steamrolled weeks before. This time, the chairs were arranged in a tight circle. Instead of the usual row and podium layout, as if the board was preparing for an emotional intervention rather than a community meeting. Karen sat at the center of the circle with a red folder in her lap, her posture perfect. Her expression somewhere between righteous indignation and barely concealed panic. The moment I walked in, I could feel the shift in energy. No one made eye contact. Some glanced up, then immediately looked down. A couple of neighbors I barely knew gave me small, sympathetic nods. The kind people give when they know a fight is coming and they're glad it's not theirs. Karen didn't look up. She was waiting for control. As soon as everyone settled, she opened the folder and began reading from a prepared statement. Her voice was calm, clinical, and utterly performative. She claimed that my recent land use, her words, was creating hostility and tension in the neighborhood. She cited the fence posts, the temporary gate, the sign. She framed it as a campaign of aggression that was making residents feel unsafe. I didn't say a word. I waited because her mistake wasn't what she said. It was what she didn't say. When she finished, she looked at the rest of the board with an expression that begged for consensus. But this time, she didn't get it immediately. Rob, the quiet board member I'd spoken to at the hardware store, raised a hand slowly and said, "Has there actually been a violation here? Something against the HOA charter?" Karen blinked. "It's a hostile act," she replied. "It's the spirit of the policy, the tone. It violates the cooperative nature we've built here." Another member, Jenna, shifted in her seat. "But is it illegal or out of compliance?" Karen didn't answer directly. Instead, she redirected as she always did,
asking the board to vote on a motion to issue a cease and desist against me for what she described as obstruction of shared space. I finally spoke. I placed a thin folder on the table and said, "Before anyone votes, I'd like to submit this for the record." I opened it and began distributing copies, a notarized deed for the parcel, the zoning map with clear boundary markings, a letter from the city planner verifying my rights to the access lane, a printed screenshot showing Karen's trailer illegally parked across it, and just for good measure, a photo of the very same gate she was protesting, complete with a timestamp proving it had not impeded any legal traffic. The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. Karen's face didn't twitch, but I could see the color shifting in her cheeks. She tried to regain control, asking the board to table the discussion until legal counsel could review the document, but the damage had been done. The spell she'd cast over the group was cracking. Rob finally said, "I think we need to be more careful about how we escalate things. This seems like a personal dispute, not an HOA matter." Another board member murmured agreement. Karen tried to pivot, but the room had already shifted. The meeting was adjourned without a vote, and I walked out into the cool evening air, feeling for the first time in a long time like I wasn't the only one who saw through her. The next few days were strangely quiet. No new notices appeared on my door. No chalk arrows, no hired compliance consultant. I knew it wouldn't last. Karen was regrouping. That's how people like her operated. They weren't built to accept defeat. They just changed strategies. And sure enough, that Friday, a black city vehicle pulled up outside my house. A man in a collared shirt stepped out and began taking photos, not just of my property, but of the fence line, the drainage easement, even my mailbox. I stepped outside and asked if I could help. He introduced himself as a code enforcement officer responding to an anonymous complaint. I almost laughed. Of course, it was anonymous. He walked the property with me, respectful and neutral, making notes on a tablet. I showed him the documentation, explained the situation, and handed him a copy of the plat map. After 30 minutes, he thanked me for my time and said there were no violations. But before he left, he paused and said, "You've got a target on your back. I've had 3 calls about this address in the last week. All anonymous. Be careful." That warning hung in my mind like smoke. Karen wasn't done. She was just getting smarter. I knew what would come next. Character attacks, whispers, manipulating perception. So, I took the next step quietly. I installed a second gate. This one at the front end of the access lane closer to the main road. It was identical to the first. Clean, simple, legal, but it completed the enclosure. Now, the entire back lane, the easement, and the strip of land running alongside Karen's yard were fenced off, locked, and legally mine. I posted another sign, identical to the first. Then I sat back and waited. It didn't take long. The following morning, I heard the sound of someone rattling the gate. I looked out the window and saw Karen's gardener standing in the lane, his truck idling awkwardly on the street behind him. He looked confused. I stepped outside and explained politely that the land was now privately owned and access had been restricted. He apologized, said he hadn't known, and drove off. Less than an hour later, Karen marched up to my door, banging with her knuckles like a sheriff with a warrant. I opened it calmly. She didn't even wait. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed. "You're creating chaos. You're cutting off access people have used for years." I replied, "Access they didn't own. Access they assumed was theirs." Theirs. A difference.
She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "This is harassment. You're harassing me." I didn't flinch. "I'm exercising my property rights. The same ones you tried to deny me." Her lips twitched. "You'll regret this." Then she turned and stormed away. What she did next proved exactly how desperate she was becoming. That evening, I received a call from a local journalist. Apparently, someone had submitted a press release to the neighborhood beat, claiming that a vindictive homeowner was using legal loopholes to bully an HOA president and endanger community access. The journalist wanted my side. I invited him over, showed him the documentation, the maps, the emails, the fake violations, everything. He sat on my porch for an hour scribbling note. 2 days later, an article was published online titled, "Fence Feud Turns into Suburban Power Play." It wasn't flattering to either of us, but it painted a much more balanced picture than Karen had hoped for. And more importantly, it went viral. Within a week, the article had been shared on local forums, Facebook groups, even a Reddit thread. People from other neighborhoods began chiming in, sharing their own HOA horror stories. The narrative shifted. Karen, once seen as the benevolent enforcer of suburban order, was now portrayed as a petty tyrant. The HOA board began receiving emails from residents demanding accountability. Rob told me privately that several people had begun asking if Karen could be recalled. One person even started a petition. The lawsuit came on a Thursday. I'd half expected it, maybe even anticipated it in that tight, silent way a person waits for thunder after the lightning's already cracked the sky. A plain manila envelope delivered by a courier. No knock, no greeting, just dropped on my porch like a forgotten package. Inside was a civil complaint filed by Karen through a local attorney, one who, after a quick Google search, turned out to be her cousin. The accusations were exactly what I expected. Yet reading them still felt like swallowing gravel: harassment, malicious land use, emotional distress, intentional infliction of suffering. The phrases were dramatic, overblown, the kind of language that sounded powerful in isolation but fell apart under scrutiny. She claimed that my property modifications were a personal vendetta, that I had engaged in a campaign of intimidation, that my actions had created a hostile living environment, and that her mental health was now fragile and damaged as a result of my behavior. It was laughable and infuriating at the same time, like being punched by someone holding a glass of wine. She was trying to turn everything around, paint herself as the victim, cast me as a bully with too much time and money on my hand. But what she hadn't counted on was how thoroughly I'd prepared for this moment. I didn't need to exaggerate. I had evidence. I spent that entire weekend assembling my countersuit. My folder of documentation had grown into a file box, and the file box had turned into a cabinet. I had emails, timestamps, videos, city records, witness statements. I had printouts of every compliance notice she'd ever taped to my mailbox, screenshots of next door posts where she'd alluded to troublemakers, copies of zoning regulations she'd pretended didn't exist. And then the real ace, the drone footage, a perfectly captured visual history showing the boundaries of my property, the encroachments from her yard, and the timeline of changes that occurred without notice or permission. I even had one clip, dates stamped in crystal clear, of her walking past my side gate with a clipboard, stopping to peer through a crack, muttering into her phone while measuring something with a small tape. Trespassing, documented, plain as day. I reached out to a local attorney, not a cousin or friend, but a real professional. We met Monday morning. I explained everything from the beginning, laid out the timeline, and
handed over the documents. After 30 minutes, he sat back and said, if even half of this holds up in court, she's got a serious problem. I said, it all holds up. He smiled. While the legal wheels turned, something strange began to happen. People in the neighborhood started treating me differently. Not warmly exactly, but with a kind of cautious respect. It was like watching a crowd of people who had once laughed at a dog barking finally realized it wasn't barking. It was warning them. A few neighbors waved as I passed. One even stopped to ask about my sunflowers, complimenting the way I designed the fence line. There were no apologies. No. One admitted they'd once voted against me or ignored me in meetings or silently sided with Karen, but I could feel it in their body language. They knew, and it made her furious. Karen tried to reassert her image, tried to rally support like she had in the past, but the cracks in her influence were starting to show. At the next HOA meeting, she announced a new motion, a proposed fine for residents who installed any structure within 15 feet of shared spaces, a vague term that clearly meant my gate. But this time, the board pushed back. Jenna, the same woman who'd once silently gone along with every vote, raised her hand and asked, "Where is that language in the bylaws?" Karen stammered. Rob added, "It seems like you're targeting one resident. This feels personal." Karen turned red but tried to laugh it off, insisting it was about preserving aesthetics and protecting resale value. No one seconded the motion. It died on the table. The following week, someone leaked the legal complaint. I hadn't done it, and I doubted my attorney would, but someone did. It maybe a clerk at the courthouse? Maybe someone on the board. Either way, screenshots of the lawsuit began circulating online, not just in our neighborhood group chats, but on broader local forums. People started reading the details, the absurd phrasing, the emotional pleas, the obvious contradictions, and the tide shifted further. By now, the original article about our dispute had resurfaced. Someone edited it with updates, new context, links to public document. The narrative was no longer mine versus hers. It had become something bigger. A story about control and retaliation and what happens when petty authority meets stubborn resistance. Karen responded the only way she knew how, with escalation. She hosted an emergency HOA meeting without the board's full approval. Billed it as a resident open forum and handed out printed flyers around the neighborhood inviting people to discuss the growing threat to community unity. I went, of course I did. I sat in the back, arms crossed, watching as she stood at the front with a printed slideshow showing photos of my gates, my signs, even my sunflowers. She spoke about uncooperative elements, about invasive behavior, about losing the spirit of neighborliness. It would have been comical if it weren't so sad. No one clapped. No one interrupted. When she was finished, she asked if anyone had questions. Silence. Then a man I didn't recognize raised his hand and said, "Why did you cut down his fence?" Her face froze. "Excuse me?" He repeated the question calmly. "That's how this started, right? You destroyed his fence without permission." "That's what the article said." "Is it true?" She fumbled. Claimed it was a misunderstanding. Said it was a corrective action, but the room was no longer buying it. She was exposed. Naked, not physically, but socially. Her control was slipping through her fingers, and she couldn't grasp it fast. Enough. A week later, the HOA board held a closed-door session. I wasn't invited. But word traveled fast. They voted to suspend Karen from the presidency pending legal resolution of the complaint. It wasn't a full removal. Not yet, but it stripped her of enforcement power. She could no longer issue notices. She could no longer call emergency vote. She was, for the first time in years, just another resident. When the announcement was emailed out, I read it 3 times before smiling. Not because I wanted power. I never did, but because justice had finally started to peek its head over the hedge. Karen couldn't let it go. She came to my house. One last time unannounced. No clipboard, no printed notice, just her in a trembling rage, standing at the foot of my driveway with her fists clenched. "You think you won," she spat. "You think this is over?" I didn't answer. I let the silence stretch until it made her uncomfortable. Finally, I said, "I didn't want to fight you. You made it a war." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but there was no apology in them, only venom. She turned and walked away. The first sign that everything was unraveling for Karen came quietly, almost anticlimactically, in the form of a new property appraisal. It had been triggered automatically, thanks to my zoning inquiry and the modifications I'd filed for my own property line enhancements. While I had only added a few legal structures and decorative elements on my end, the review encompassed adjacent properties as well, particularly those that shared access lanes or borders like Karen's. I received a copy of the updated documents from the county office. And though it wasn't something most people would notice right away, I saw it for exactly what it was, the beginning of a slow, irreversible domino fall. Karen's property value had dropped again. Not drastically, but just enough to get the attention of her mortgage bank. The note in the updated file cited unverified property usage, boundary disputes, and neighborhood legal activity as contributing factors. I didn't need to do anything more. The system she had manipulated for years was finally holding her accountable in the language she understood least: bureaucracy. She had always thrived on informal power. Whispers, meetings, guilt trip, but paperwork, permits, and public records didn't bend for her, and now they were beginning to bend against her. Around this time, a reporter from a local TV affiliate reached out. The viral article had grown legs, and the story was gaining traction beyond just online forums. The reporter, a sharp woman named Allison with a calm but incisive tone, wanted to film a short segment on HOA conflicts escalating into civil dispute. She asked if I'd be willing to speak on camera, even if anonymously. I said no at first, but after some thought, and after seeing how Karen continued to flail publicly while pretending nothing was wrong, I changed my mind. I agreed to meet Allison at a nearby park under conditions that my face would be blurred and name withheld. I didn't speak like someone out for revenge. I spoke like someone tired of being pushed. I laid out the events in careful, concise terms. I presented evidence, showed the plat maps, explained the harassment, and made one quiet point that Allison ran as the closing line in her report. Sometimes people in power forget that rules protect everyone, not just them. When the segment aired, it ran for less than 5 minutes, but that was enough. The next day, I overheard someone at the grocery store talking about it. A cashier mentioned it while bagging bread. 2 neighbors I barely knew nodded to me as I walked my dog that evening. I hadn't won a popularity contest, but I'd done something better. I told the truth and now it was out there. Karen didn't handle it well. She sent out a mass email to the HOA mailing list the following afternoon. A rambling, incoherent attempt at damage control framed as a community update. She accused certain residents of seeking media attention to defame the neighborhood.
She insisted the HOA was functioning well and that false narratives were creating division. What she didn't realize was that her words no longer had the effect they used to. People weren't falling in line anymore. The spell had broken. That same night, the board held a special session without her. According to Rob, they voted to initiate a formal recall process, the first in the HOA's history. Karen had become a liability. No one wanted her at the helm, especially not with a lawsuit underway and media attention swirling. The vote didn't remove her outright, but it opened the door. Petitions were circulated. Residents began organizing. Informally. People who had never spoken up before suddenly finding their voices. And every time Karen tried to rally support, she found fewer and fewer people willing to respond. Then came the letter from the city's compliance division. I received my copy first, followed by at least 3 other residents who messaged me privately to confirm. It was an official notice that the city would be conducting a full review of HOA practices within our neighborhood, including past citations, zoning irregularities, and reported harassment. It had all started from one of my earliest emails, one I had forgotten I'd sent in the flurry of gathering documentation. Apparently, the city had opened a file and quietly started gathering information. Now it was public. Now it was official. Karen's name was mentioned in the letter, not accusing her of wrongdoing, but listing her as the primary administrative contact, which meant she was now under a magnifying glass she couldn't control. She could lie to neighbors, but she couldn't lie to auditors. Her world began to shrink after that. The landscapers she'd used for years stopped coming. Rumor had it she was late on payments. Her social circle thinned out. Wine nights were canceled without explanation. Neighbors who once pretended to adore her now crossed the street to avoid her driveway. And perhaps the most satisfying moment came 2 weeks later when I walked past her property and noticed the most ironic detail of all. Her backyard gate, the one that used to open onto the access lane behind her home, had been sealed shut. A makeshift wooden panel now covered it, hastily nailed and unpainted like a scab on the side of her yard. She hadn't just lost her grip on the HOA. She'd lost her exit. The land she used to treat as her own was now locked from both ends, quietly transformed into a space she could no longer access or manipulate. The irony of it wasn't lost on anyone. I didn't gloat. I didn't send a letter or stand outside waiting for her to notice. I didn't speak ill of her in meetings or online. That's not how I wanted this to end. She had humiliated herself. All I had done was shine a light and document the fallout. Let her spin herself into the ground. Let her taste the same isolation she had served others. But one more turn was still left. A legal hearing had been scheduled for the following month. Not a full trial, just a preliminary review in front of a magistrate to assess whether Karen's claims had merit. My lawyer was confident. He said her case would likely be dismissed on summary grounds, but I told him to proceed anyway. I wanted it on the record. I wanted every lie, every manipulation, every fabricated violation to be filed, cross-examined, and formally rejected. I wanted her to sit in a room where her words carried weight and watch them shatter against the truth. Not because I needed revenge, but because I needed closure. The day before the hearing, something unexpected happened. A small envelope arrived at my door. Hand-delivered, no postage. Inside was a single note written in a familiar sharp-angled cursive. It read, "You win. I'm moving. Don't bother coming tomorrow."
There was no signature, but it didn't need one. I stood on my porch, holding the letter. Heart thudding, not with triumph, but with something heavier. I had spent so much time preparing for this fight that the idea of it ending felt strange, empty even, but also clean. She was gone, or would be soon, and the neighborhood would finally have a chance to breathe again. The next morning, my lawyer appeared in court anyway, just in case. Karen never showed. Her attorney submitted a motion to withdraw the complaint, citing personal relocation and loss of client cooperation. It took nearly 3 weeks after Karen's note for the moving truck to arrive. It pulled in one gray Thursday morning while most people were still at work. A dull white vehicle with no logos, just 2 men in navy shirts carrying boxes down the walkway like it was any other suburban goodbye. There was no fanfare, no send-off, no curious crowd. I watched from my upstairs window as they loaded item after item into the truck: lamps, chairs, plastic bins marked garden, a rolled-up rug that had once graced her front entryway like a red carpet for visitors she wanted to impress. The woman herself never appeared outside, if she was even there at all. She stayed hidden behind the curtains, avoiding the world she had once tried so desperately to control. By noon, the truck was gone. And the house that had once served as her kingdom sat quietly, stripped of its ornaments, with blinds closed, and a real estate sign jammed awkwardly into the front yard. The sign didn't say for sale by owner. It listed a local agency, one known for quick turnarounds and distressed properties. That said, more than anything else, she wasn't leaving on her own terms. She was retreating. And though there was no victory parade, no chorus of applause, I felt the weight of her absence settle into the air like clean silence after a long drawn-out storm. Word spread quickly. The HOA board sent out a formal email 2 days later announcing Karen's official resignation and confirming her relocation. It was brief and diplomatic, with no mention of the lawsuit, the recall vote, or the property conflicts. Just a polite statement wishing her well and informing residents that a special election would be held to choose a new president. But the undercurrent was unmistakable. Everyone knew there were no more whispers behind mailboxes, no more subtle stares during HOA meetings. The fear had lifted. Even Rob, who had always kept his head down, began speaking more confidently during gatherings. He proposed amending the bylaws to limit unilateral action by any one board member. Jenna seconded it. It passed without objection. The change was small but symbolic. The days of quiet intimidation were over. Something new was taking root slowly and cautiously, like grass growing back through scorched earth. As for me, I didn't run for the board. I didn't want that kind of role. Not after everything. I continued to attend meetings, to voice my opinion when it mattered, but I had no interest in governing. I just wanted peace. And in the weeks that followed, I finally found it. My mornings became slower. I stopped checking my mailbox with dread. The constant low-level anxiety that had followed me through every petty note, every false citation, every shadow under my security camera finally began to fade. I planted more flowers. I refinished the fence. I invited my sister's family over for a barbecue on the first Saturday of spring. And for the first time in months, I hosted guests without worrying someone would photograph my lawn or report my grill for being too close to the wall. Life resumed, but Karen's departure didn't erase everything. Her legacy lingered in small ways, in the bylaws she'd twisted, in the neighbors she'd alienated, in the subtle tension that sometimes returned when people spoke her name. One afternoon, I found myself walking past her old property, now listed online as under renovation. The gate I had seen her close so many times was still patched with that crooked wooden slab. though the grass had started to grow tall around it. A new owner would come eventually, maybe someone better, maybe not. But they wouldn't get away with what she did. The community had changed. Eyes were open now. A month after her departure, I received an envelope from the county office addressed to me directly. Inside was a notification confirming the updated registry of the access lane and the adjacent parcel in my name, along with a note from the zoning division thanking me for my detailed and consistent documentation during the review process. It was the most bureaucratic form of closure I could imagine, and yet it meant everything. The boundaries were clear. Now, they weren't just lines on a map. They were proof. Proof that standing up had worked. That truth had won, not because it shouted louder, but because it never flinched. Still, one final piece remained unfinished. I'd been saving it, holding it close. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I gathered the original boards from the fence Karen had destroyed. What was left of them anyway? I had kept the broken pieces in my garage, unsure why at first, maybe out of stubbornness or sentiment. Now I knew. I sanded them down, planed the rough edges, and reassembled them into a simple bench. Nothing fancy, just a sturdy place to sit. I carried it out to the far end of the narrow path that wrapped behind Karen's old house, my land now, and placed it in the shade beneath a tree that had been there longer than either of us. From that bench, you could see the neighborhood clearly. You could watch the dogs walking their owners, the kids chasing each other across driveways, the slow rise and fall of normal life, unbothered by power games. I sat there for a while that day, watching lights scatter through the branches, remembering the first time I'd seen Karen standing in that lane, clipboard in hand, deciding who belonged and who didn't. She had seen fences and rules and violations. I saw sunlight, space, peace. And it struck me then how little she'd understood what she was fighting for. It was never about property. It was about control. She couldn't build without knocking others down. Couldn't thrive without someone else to dominate. And in the end, she hadn't been removed. She had removed herself, not by force, not through violence, but by making herself unwelcome. The system she twisted had finally spit her out. That night, I went back to my porch, sat with a cup of coffee, and watched the last rays of sun skim over the rooftop. The house next to mine stood quiet. The gates remained locked, but my door was open. My yard was blooming, and my fence, restored, stronger than before, stood without apology. I had spent months responding to every attack, every manipulation, every trick. I'd used laws and patience and truth as my tools. And now I wasn't responding anymore. I was just living, not triumphant, not smug, just grounded. Safe. And if another Karen ever tried to rise, to stir the dust and push her way through the cracks again, the neighborhood would remember. The files were still there, the records, the footage, the bylaw amendments. All of it sat in neatly labeled folders, a quiet arsenal of facts and precedent. Not for revenge, not for spite, but because people forget quickly, and power always looks for new doors. I'd be there to make sure they stayed shut when they needed to. Not locked out of fear, just firm, clear. As the wind moved gently through the trees that night, I thought back to that first moment. The chainsaw, the red tape, the look on her face when she realized she wasn't untouchable. And I realized something I hadn't understood before. That day wasn't the worst day. It was the turning point. The moment the truth began to bloom through all the noise. And the thing about fences I'd learned was that they weren't about keeping people out. They were about showing where things stood, who respected space, who didn't, and who, when tested, knew how to hold the line.